What would you do if a stranger knocked on your door in the middle of the night? A storm raging outside. A man, soaked to the bone, his face streaked with rain and desperation, pleading for help. Would you open the door? Or would you hesitate? Unsure, afraid, wondering if you were inviting trouble into your home? John Miller didn't hesitate. He saw a soldier in need, not a threat. He made a choice, not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because it was right. And that choice changed everything. But here's the real question. Would you have done the same? The Texas sky stretched vast and endless, the golden hues of sunset washing over the land like a painter's final strokes on a masterpiece. John Miller stood on the porch of his farmhouse, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, feeling the last warmth of the day before the coolness of evening settled in. The land before him was quiet, except for the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance and the rhythmic creak of the porch swaying gently in the breeze. This was the life he had known for as long as he could remember. A life of hard work, of early mornings and aching joints, of soil that resisted every seed, but somehow still managed to yield enough to keep the farm going. A life of solitude. At 72, John had grown accustomed to the quiet. It wasn't loneliness, not exactly. It was just the way things had always been. His wife had passed nearly 2 decades ago, and his only son, his boy, was gone too, taken by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan. After that, the house had felt emptier, the land quieter. He had found ways to fill the silence. The farm demanded his attention, and the work was never-ending. Fixing fences, tending to the cattle, preparing for seasons that came and went in their unrelenting cycle. It gave him purpose, kept his hands busy, and most days, that was enough. But tonight, something felt different. He could see it in the sky, the way the dark clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling in slow and heavy like a living thing. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of coming rain, thick and earthy. His bones ached in a way he had come to recognize, not from age, but from years of reading the weather through feeling alone. A storm was coming, a real one. It had been weeks since the land had seen a decent rain, and he had been praying for it. Yet as he watched the sky darken, an unease settled deep in his chest. It wasn't just the storm, though. It was something else, something just beyond his grasp, like an itch at the back of his mind that he couldn't quite scratch. A feeling he hadn't had in years. The kind that had saved his life more than once in Vietnam. The kind that told him change was coming. He took one last sip of his coffee, the bitterness familiar and grounding, before stepping inside. The house was much the same as it had always been. Sturdy, practical, built by his grandfather's hands and passed down through the generations. The wooden floors creaked under his boots as he moved through the kitchen, setting his mug in the sink. Rain began to tap against the windows, first soft, then steady, then heavy. The wind howled through the cracks in the old farmhouse, whispering against the walls like voices just out of reach. John settled into his armchair, the leather cracked with age, a dog-eared paperback resting on the side table. He reached for it, intending to lose himself in the well-worn pages, but the storm outside had a different rhythm tonight, something urgent, something insistent. He leaned back, listening, his fingers drumming absently against the armrest. Then it happened. 3 knocks, distinct, sharp against the wood of his front door. John froze. It wasn't just the rarity of visitors that set his heart pounding. It was the timing. The storm raging outside, the late hour, the unmistakable edge of desperation in the sound. Slowly, he placed the book down and reached for the old shotgun he kept beside the chair. Not a fear, not really, just caution. A man alone in the country learned to be careful, especially when unexpected visitors arrived in the dead of night. He took a steady breath, moved toward the door, and called out, his voice firm. "Who's there?" Silence for a moment. Then a voice, young, strained, barely audible over the wind. "Please, sir, I need help." And just like that, John knew. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just arrived on his doorstep. John hesitated for a moment, his grip tightening around the shotgun as the storm raged outside. The knock had been firm but not aggressive, urgent but not threatening. The voice, young, desperate, cut through the howling wind. He knew better than to open his door for just anyone, especially in the middle of a storm. Yet something about the tone, the sheer need in those few words, made him pause. He shifted the shotgun to one hand and unlatched the chain, cracking the door open just enough to see who stood beyond it. A figure hunched against the downpour, rain streaming from his soaked clothes, his breath visible in the cold air. The porch light flickered, casting shadows over his face, but John could see enough. The young man couldn't have been more than 25. His short-cropped hair, military style, clung to his forehead, and his uniform, mud-streaked, torn at the sleeve, was plastered to his skin from the rain. A thin trickle of blood ran from a small gash above his right eyebrow, disappearing into the collar of his jacket. He was shaking from cold or exhaustion, maybe both. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir," the young man said, his voice strained. I just need help. Please." John studied him carefully. His posture, the squared shoulders despite the evident fatigue, the way he stood with an instinctive alertness, even in his weakened state. This wasn't just some lost traveler. This was a soldier. John had been one himself long ago, and even now, decades later, he could still recognize the bearing of a man trained for war. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice gruff but steady. The young man straightened slightly, despite his obvious struggle to remain upright. "Private Ethan Walker. I got separated from my unit during training exercise. My radio's dead, and I've been walking for hours trying to find shelter." John's eyes flicked down to the insignia on Ethan's jacket. A stylized falcon, unfamiliar. He had spent a lifetime keeping up with military affairs, knew most unit patches like the back of his hand. But this one, he had never seen it before. A training exercise. That was the official line. But something about it didn't sit right. Rain pounded the porch roof, dripping off the edges in thick sheets. The wind bit through John's flannel shirt, sharp and relentless. He could end this right now. Send the soldier on his way. Tell him to try the next ranch, 5 miles down the road. No one would fault him for it. A man alone had to be careful. But then his son. His boy would have been just a little older than this young man if he had made it home from Afghanistan. If he had stumbled, wounded and desperate, onto a stranger's porch in a storm like this, would that stranger have turned him away? John let out a slow breath and unlatched the door fully. "Come in before you catch your death." Ethan hesitated only a second before stepping inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. His entire body slumped as if the simple act of being out of the storm had drained the last of his strength. "Bathrooms down the hall," John said, setting the shotgun back in its usual place. "You can dry off there. I'll find you some clothes." "Thank you, sir," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. John watched as the young man limped toward the bathroom, leaving muddy footprints in his wake. He wasn't just exhausted, he was hurt. That much was clear, but he moved like someone accustomed to pushing through pain. A soldier's instinct. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. John pulled open an old cedar chest near the living room. It hadn't been touched in years, its contents preserved like a time capsule of another life. Inside, folded neatly, were his son's clothes. He hesitated before pulling out a flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants. They'd be a little big on the young man, but they'd do. Placing the clothes outside the bathroom door, he moved to the kitchen, lighting the stove. He had canned homemade chicken soup last autumn. Good, hearty stuff that could warm even the coldest night. He opened a jar, letting the rich aroma fill the small kitchen as he stirred. When Ethan emerged, he looked better, cleaner at least, but the exhaustion was still etched deep in his features. The borrowed clothes hung loosely on his frame, making him seem even younger than before. His damp hair clung to his forehead, and though he tried to stand straighter, John could see the subtle signs of weariness in his movements. "Sit," John said, motioning to the wooden table. Ethan sank into the chair, his hands wrapping around the bowl of steaming soup before he even picked up the spoon. The smell alone seemed to ground him. "When did you last eat?" John asked, settling across from him with his own bowl. "Yesterday morning, I think," Ethan replied before taking a careful sip of the broth. He let out a quiet sigh, the warmth spreading through him. We were on a special training mission. Things got complicated. John didn't miss the way he hesitated, how his eyes flicked toward the window, as if expecting someone, something. The old farmer had seen that look before, in men carrying secrets, in soldiers who had seen things they couldn't talk about. "Your unit must be looking for you," John commented casually, breaking off a piece of cornbread and handing it to Ethan. For just a second, Ethan's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. A heartbeat of silence. Then he forced a nod. "Yeah, they are." He took another bite of soup, but John could tell there was more to this story than the young man was letting on. And something told him that by letting Ethan in tonight, he had just stepped into something far bigger than he had realized. The storm had passed by midnight, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The house, which had once creaked with the relentless wind, now settled into silence, save for the occasional distant rumble of thunder retreating across the open plains. John lay in his bed, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that had been gnawing at him since Ethan Walker arrived. Something wasn't right. He wasn't a man prone to paranoia. Life on the farm had taught him the value of trusting his instincts, and right now, those instincts were whispering that the young soldier sleeping under his roof wasn't just some lost trainee. The way he spoke, the way his eyes darted toward the windows, the way he had carefully chosen his words over dinner, it all sat wrong with John. Then, there was that insignia, the one he couldn't place despite decades of keeping up with military units and their symbols. John exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. Maybe he was overthinking things. The boy was exhausted, injured, likely scared. It wasn't his business to pry. He had done his part, given him shelter, food, dry clothes. Come morning, Ethan would be on his way, and John could go back to his quiet life. But something still nagged at him. Just as sleep began to pull at him, a sound reached his ears. Not the settling of the house or the wind shifting through the trees. Something deliberate, something quiet. Footsteps. John's pulse quickened. Slowly, he pushed back the covers, moving with the careful silence of a man who had learned long ago how to listen before he acted. He reached for the old revolver he kept in a nightstand, his fingers wrapping around the worn grip, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the murmur of a voice. Low, controlled. John stood, his socked feet making no sound against the wooden floor as he crept toward the doorway. He moved through the dark hallway, his heartbeat steady, the years of military discipline keeping him calm despite the unease curling in his gut. As he neared the living room, the voice became clearer. Ethan's. John stopped just outside the doorway, pressing himself against the wall, listening. "Yes, sir," Ethan was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "Understand. No one suspects anything. Just an old farmer." John's grip tightened around the revolver. The words hit him like a slow-moving train, not an impact, but in the way they gradually sunk in, spreading cold through his veins. Just an old farmer. No one suspects anything. His breath remained even, but inside, something shifted. He had been right. Something was off. Ethan wasn't just a lost soldier seeking shelter. There was something bigger at play, something John hadn't yet put together. Carefully, he inched forward just enough to see into the dimly lit room. Ethan stood near the window, his back partially turned, a small device pressed to his ear. Not a standard military radio. Something else. Something unfamiliar. John's mind worked quickly. If Ethan was speaking to someone, then he wasn't truly alone. He had contacts. People who knew where he was. People who were expecting him. And if they weren't fellow soldiers looking for a missing comrade, then who were they? Ethan was tense, his free hand resting on the windowsill, fingers tapping in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Nervous energy. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. John exhaled silently, retreating as quietly as he had come. He slipped back down the hall, moving with the kind of patience that only a man who had spent nights waiting in silence could master. He returned to his bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, setting the revolver on the nightstand beside him. Now, he had a decision to make. He had given the boy shelter because it was the right thing to do, Because once, a long time ago, he had prayed that if his son were ever lost, someone would do the same for him. But that didn't mean he was blind. He wasn't some naive old man who couldn't see when something was wrong. Ethan Walker wasn't telling the full truth. And tomorrow, John was going to find out why. The morning broke quiet and cold, the storm having left the land drenched but peaceful. The sky, still bruised from the night before, was just beginning to blush with the first light of dawn when John rose from his bed. Despite the unease that had followed him into sleep, he went about his usual morning routine, pulling on his boots, filling the kettle, stepping out onto the porch to breathe in the crisp, rain-scented air. The world felt still, untouched, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. But John knew better. His mind kept circling back to what he had overheard. Ethan's whispered words, the careful way he had spoken, the device he had used. No one suspects anything, just an old farmer. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, the rising sun setting the fields aglow. It would be a good day for working the land, he thought absently, if not for the fact that something didn't sit right. A feeling like a weight in his gut, one he couldn't shake. He was still standing there when he heard it. Engines. Not the steady hum of a pickup truck rolling down the long dirt road leading to his farmhouse. No, these were heavier, deeper, multiple vehicles, moving fast. John straightened, his grip instinctively tightening on the railing as dust kicked up in the distance. His frown deepened as the first police cruiser came into view, followed by a second, and then a sleek black SUV rolling to a stop behind them. The doors swung open in unison, and within seconds, uniformed officers were stepping out, hands hovering near their weapons. John didn't move, didn't speak. He had the calm patience of a man who had lived long enough to know that sudden movements often led to trouble. Then, from the SUV, a man emerged, tall, clean-cut, wearing a dark suit that set him apart from the rest. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt before stepping forward, eyes locking onto John's with practiced authority. "Mr. Miller?" The man's voice was smooth, professional. He reached into his pocket, pulling out an ID badge and flashing it quickly. Too quickly. "Agent Dawson, Department of Defense." John said nothing, watching as the officers fanned out behind the agent, their movements precise, coordinated. "We're looking for a military deserter who may have passed through this area last night," Dawson continued, slipping the badge back into his pocket. "Private Ethan Walker. We have reason to believe he's dangerous and in possession of classified intelligence. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" John didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped lightly against the porch railing, his mind working fast. The speed. That was what bothered him. He had overheard Ethan's conversation in the dead of night. No way had an official manhunt been organized and deployed this quickly. Not unless they had already been looking. Something wasn't right. Still, John kept his expression neutral. "Deserter, you say?" "That's correct," Dawson said, his eyes sharp. "It's important that we take him into custody immediately." Before John could answer, movement in the window caught the attention of one of the officers. "Sir, target sighted inside." Everything happened in a blur. The officers surged forward, pushing past John without hesitation. He turned just in time to see them burst into the house, weapons drawn, barking orders. "Hands where we can see them. On the ground now." John followed, heart pounding, his voice rising over the chaos. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This boy came to my door injured and lost. This is a matter of national security." Dawson cut him off coldly. "Stay out of it, Mr. Miller." Ethan stood in the living room, his hands already raised, his face drained of color. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just let them drag him forward, twisting his arms behind his back as the cuffs snapped into place. John stepped forward instinctively. "He's not dangerous," he growled. "You don't need to treat him like some damn criminal." Ethan met John's eyes then, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his expression was entirely clear. No hesitation, no guardedness. Just something John couldn't quite place. Something that looked like both regret and gratitude. "You're a good man, John," Ethan said quietly, just before they shoved him toward the door. "I won't forget this." Then he was gone, hauled out onto the porch, pushed into the waiting SUV, and within moments, the convoy of vehicles was disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. John stood frozen, staring after them, the emptiness of the house pressing in around him. Something was wrong. Everything about this was too fast, too precise. If Ethan had truly been a deserter, would they have found him this quickly? Would they have been so prepared? And if he was so dangerous, why hadn't he fought back? Why hadn't he run when he had the chance? His gaze drifted to the spot where Ethan had been standing just moments ago. A small puddle of rainwater still lingered on the wooden floor, along with muddy footprints, proof that he had been here, that this had all really happened. John's jaw tightened. The insignia, the strange radio device, the hushed phone call in the middle of the night. None of it made sense. And John Miller wasn't the kind of man to let something like this go. John sat at his kitchen table long after the last of the dust from the SUVs had settled. The house felt emptier than it had the night before, the silence heavier. He stared at the scuffed wooden surface, tracing the grain with his fingers as his mind turned over the events of the morning. They had come too fast. They had been too prepared. And now Ethan was gone. John wasn't the type to stick his nose where it didn't belong. He had spent most of his life minding his own business, keeping to himself, letting the world outside his land spin on without interference. But this wasn't sitting right. He had spent enough years in the military to recognize a well-oiled machine when he saw one, and those men had operated with the kind of precision that didn't belong to local law enforcement. And Dawson, the way he had flashed his badge just a little too quickly, the way he had dismissed John, the way he had spoken with a kind of authority that expected no resistance. It didn't add up. John pushed back his chair, stood, and grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. If something didn't sit right, he figured the best place to start asking questions was with someone he knew he could trust. Bill Matheson had been the county sheriff for nearly 30 years, and he had been John's friend for even longer. If federal agents had stormed onto John's property and taken a man into custody, Bill would know about it. The drive into town was uneventful, the morning sun casting long shadows across the wet roads, steam rising from the pavement as the heat set in. It was early, but John knew where to find Bill. If he wasn't at the sheriff's office, he'd be at the diner across the street, nursing a coffee and chatting with the regulars. Sure enough, when John stepped into the sheriff's office, Bill was sitting behind his desk, feet kicked up, flipping through a newspaper. He glanced up, surprise flickering across his face before he set the paper down. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill said, grinning. "John Miller, in town before noon. This must be important." John didn't smile. He took off his hat, gripping it in one hand as he stepped forward. "I need to ask you something." Bill's grin faded. He knew John well enough to recognize when something was serious. "All right," he said, swinging his legs off the desk. "What's on your mind?" John sat in the chair across from him, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "This morning, I had some visitors. Federal agents. Said they were looking for a military deserter. Took him right out of my house." Bill frowned. "I didn't hear anything about that." John's gaze didn't waver. "You sure?" "John, if federal agents were operating in my county, I damn well know about it." Bill pulled his chair closer to the desk and started typing on the computer. "What was the guy's name?" "Private Ethan Walker." Bill's fingers moved across the keyboard, the screen casting a pale glow over his face. A few moments passed, then his frown deepened. He tried again. Nothing. Bill sat back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. There's no record of an arrest. No warrant issued. No request for assistance from the feds. John's stomach tightened. He already knew what Bill was going to say next, but hearing it out loud solidified the wrongness of it all. As far as official records go, Bill continued, "This Ethan Walker doesn't exist." John let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat. "That ain't possible." Bill shook his head. "I can run his name through military records, see if there's anything there. But if the feds took him and didn't leave a paper trail, that means one of two things. Either this wasn't official, or it's classified as hell." John leaned back, his mind spinning. "You ever heard of a federal agent named Dawson?" Bill's brow furrowed. He turned back to the computer, typing the name in, waiting, then shaking his head. "No Dawson in any federal law enforcement database I've got access to." John's jaw tightened. He had a badge. Bill gave him a long look. "John, you were in the service. You know as well as I do that badges can be faked." That was exactly what John had been afraid of. Bill laced his fingers together on the desk. "You want to tell me what's going on?" John considered it. He trusted Bill, but something told him the less people involved in this, the better. If what he suspected was true, if Ethan hadn't just been some lost soldier, but something more, then John asking too many questions might paint a target on his own back. So instead, he sighed and shook his head. "Just didn't sit right with me is all." Bill studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I get that." He leaned back in his chair. "Look, I don't know what you got yourself wrapped up in, but I know you, John. You don't poke around unless something don't feel right. And if something's off about this, I'd advise you to be careful." John stood, setting his hat back on his head. "I always am." Bill watched him, then sighed. "I'll ask around, see if anyone else saw anything. But if this was a classified operation, you're not going to get any straight answers." John nodded once. "Appreciate it." As he stepped out of the office and back into the Texas heat, the unease in his gut hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger. He climbed into his truck, gripping the wheel, staring down the empty road ahead. They had taken Ethan. They had erased any trace of him. And now, it was as if he had never existed. What the hell had John Miller just stepped into? 3 days had passed since Ethan had been taken, and the uneasy silence that had settled over John's farmhouse refused to leave. He had spent the past few days going through the motions, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, working the land, but his mind remained elsewhere. No one in town had seen or heard anything. No reports had surfaced in the papers or on the radio. Even Bill had come up empty-handed. Ethan Walker had disappeared into thin air, and the men who took him had left no trace behind. John had told himself to let it go. He was just an old farmer. Whatever the hell Ethan had been caught up in, it wasn't his fight. But that wasn't how his mind worked. He had been a soldier once, too, and he knew when something didn't add up. That morning, he had been out in the north pasture repairing a section of fencing when he heard it. A low, distant sound, growing steadily louder. A sound he hadn't heard in years. Helicopters. He stood slowly, pulling off his hat and shading his eyes against the glare of the sun. In the distance, dark shapes moved against the bright blue sky, growing larger by the second. His gut clenched as recognition settled in. These weren't news choppers. These were military. The ground trembled as they approached, sending up dust and bending the young wheat under their force. John took a step back, gripping the fence post as the first helicopter descended, its rotors kicking up a whirlwind of dirt and broken stalks. Another followed, and then a third. The sheer power of their arrival was unlike anything he had ever seen outside of war. This wasn't a casual visit. John straightened his back as the doors of the largest helicopter slid open. Soldiers poured out, their movements efficient, practiced, forming a perimeter as boots hit the ground in perfect synchronization. They carried themselves with the kind of precision that told John everything he needed to know. These men were the real deal. Then, from the center helicopter, a man emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp uniform adorned with ribbons and stars. A general. The man adjusted his hat, eyes scanning the field before locking onto John. Without hesitation, he strode forward, flanked by 2 heavily armed escorts. John didn't move, didn't speak. He had spent years in the military. He knew better than to be the first one to talk in situations like this. The general stopped a few feet in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. "Mr. Miller?" John gave a single nod. "That's me." The general extended a hand. "I'm General Robert Hayes, United States Army Special Operations Command. I need to speak with you about Private Walker." John didn't shake his hand. He crossed his arms instead, watching the man carefully. "Funny," he said, voice level. "The last folks who came asking about him weren't so polite." Hayes gave a small, knowing nod. "That's why we're here." He glanced toward the house. "Mind if we talk somewhere private?" John let the moment stretch, considering. He didn't trust these men, not yet. But they had landed 3 helicopters on his land, so whatever they had come for, they weren't leaving until they got it. With a curt nod, he turned and led them toward the house. Inside, The farmhouse felt even smaller with the presence of the 3 military men. John moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee before glancing toward the general. "You want one?" Hayes gave a thin smile. "Sure." John poured a second cup, sliding it across the table. The general took a seat, resting his forearms on the worn wooden surface. His escorts remained standing, watching everything with careful eyes. John pulled out a chair and sat across from Hayes. "Start talking." Hayes took a slow sip of coffee before setting the mug down. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something significant. "Private Ethan Walker is not a deserter," he said. "He's one of our most valuable operatives." John didn't react, but inside, something clicked into place. Hayes continued. "Walker was part of a covert team investigating a security breach within our own ranks. We had reason to believe that classified military technology was being sold to foreign interests by someone on the inside." John's fingers tapped against the table. "And what does that have to do with me?" Hayes met his eyes. Walker's team was closing in on their targets when his cover was compromised. He was forced to go dark, separate from his unit. That's when he ended up at your door. John leaned back slightly. "And those men who took him?" Hayes exhaled slowly. "Not federal agents." John's stomach twisted. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. "Major James Harlow," Hayes said, his tone grim. "The man who called himself Agent Dawson. He's one of the primary suspects in our investigation." John's jaw tightened. "They took Walker because they thought he had the evidence to expose them," Hayes continued. "By the time we located him, he was being held at an undisclosed location. If not for the tracking device in his boot, we might not have found him in time." John let out a slow breath, his mind piecing it all together. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "The man I let into my house wasn't just some lost soldier. He was working an undercover operation against corrupt officers in your own ranks. And the men who arrested him weren't there to bring him in. They were there to silence him." Hayes nodded. "That's correct." John shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. "And I just walked him right into their hands." "No," Hayes said firmly. "You gave him time to recover. You gave him a safe place to regroup. If not for you, he wouldn't have been able to activate his emergency beacon without detection." John stared at the general for a long moment. Then he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jesus." Hayes let the silence settle before speaking again. "Your instincts were right, Mr. Miller. And because of that, Walker is alive. And the people responsible for this? They're being brought to justice." John glanced toward the window, where the helicopters still sat in his wheat field, their presence a stark reminder of how deep this went. He had trusted his gut that night, and for once he was damn glad he had. John sat on his porch long after the helicopters had disappeared, their deafening roar replaced by the familiar quiet of the Texas plains. The wheat field had been flattened in places, the earth still disturbed from the weight of the landing gear, but John hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment from the past few days, the weight of the truth settling in his bones. He had been right. His gut had told him something was wrong, and for once he had listened. Ethan Walker hadn't been a deserter. He hadn't been a fugitive. He had been a soldier caught in a deadly game, hunted by the very people he was trying to expose. And John, just an old farmer who had been in the wrong place at the right time, had unknowingly given him the chance he needed to survive. Because of him, Ethan had lived. Because of him, men who had betrayed their country were now in custody. And yet, as he sat there, staring out at the land he had worked his entire life, he felt no triumph. No pride, just a quiet understanding of how close things had come to turning out very differently. The next few days passed in a strange haze. He returned to his routine, fixing the fence in the north pasture, tending to the cattle, repairing the damage the helicopters had left behind. But in town, things were different. People looked at him longer, spoke in hushed voices when he passed by. No one knew the truth, only that the military had arrived in force, had spoken to him, and then left just as quickly. Bill had asked him about it once, leaning against the counter at the feed store. "You gonna tell me what the hell happened out there?" John had only given him a small, knowing smile and replied, "Just an old friend stopping by." And that had been the end of it. It wasn't until a week later that the dust truly settled. The sun was dipping low in the sky when John heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle rolling up his driveway. Not the heavy rumble of military convoys, not the hurried urgency of flashing sirens, but something steady, deliberate. A government-issued sedan, sleek and black, came to a stop just beyond the porch. The door opened, and for a moment, John simply watched. Then Ethan Walker stepped out. Gone was the mud-streaked uniform, the exhaustion, the desperation in his eyes. He stood tall, rested, his hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven. His uniform was crisp, adorned with medals and insignia that John didn't recognize, but none of that mattered. It was his eyes that struck John the most. Clear, steady, grateful. John rose slowly, setting his coffee mug aside. He met Ethan's gaze as the young soldier approached, his steps careful, measured. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan smiled. "I told you I wouldn't forget." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Without a word, he stepped forward and pulled Ethan into a firm embrace. The young man stiffened slightly, caught off guard, then exhaled and returned the gesture. It wasn't long, wasn't drawn out, but it was enough. When they pulled apart, John studied him for a moment. "You look better." Ethan chuckled. "I feel better." He hesitated, glancing around the familiar porch, the same place he had stood just days before, drenched and exhausted. "I wanted to come in person, to thank you." John waved a dismissive hand. "You don't owe me anything, son." Ethan's smile faltered slightly. "I do, though. More than I can ever put into words." John shook his head, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "You were a soldier in trouble. I did what any man should do." Ethan held his gaze. Not everyone would have. John didn't have an answer for that. They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them comfortable, before Ethan finally spoke again. "We're holding a ceremony next month. Several of us are receiving commendations." He hesitated, then added, "It would mean a lot if you were there." John arched a brow. "You asking me to put on a suit?" Ethan grinned. "I'd settle for you, just showing up." John let the offer sit between them for a moment before nodding. "All right." Ethan's grin widened. "Good." The wind shifted, rustling the wheat, carrying the scent of the dry earth and the fading warmth of the day. John looked out his land, then back at Ethan, something settling inside him. Some things in life happened for a reason. And some people, no matter how unlikely, were meant to cross paths. The following week, John was out in the barn repairing a broken harness when he heard the sound of another vehicle approaching. This time, it wasn't the roar of helicopters or the steady rumble of a military truck. It was something quieter, smoother. A car, moving deliberately up his long dirt driveway, its tires crunching against the dry earth. John wiped his hands on a rag, stepped out onto the porch, and watched as the black sedan rolled to a stop. He had a feeling this wasn't just a social call. The door opened, and General Robert Hayes stepped out. Unlike their last meeting, there were no armed escorts, no soldiers lining his property. Just the general, a neatly dressed aide, and a black leather briefcase in hand. John didn't move, didn't speak, just leaned against the porch railing and waited. Hayes climbed the steps with the confidence of a man used to delivering important news. He gave a small nod. "Mr. Miller." "General," John replied evenly. "Back so soon." Hayes allowed himself the barest hint of a smile. "I figured you wouldn't be the type to come knocking on our door, so I thought I'd bring something to you instead." At that, the aide stepped forward, setting the briefcase down on the porch table. The metal latches clicked open, and as the case unfolded, John barely flicked his eyes toward the stacks of crisp $100 bills inside. Hayes took a breath. "The Department of Defense would like to extend its gratitude for your assistance. This is a token of appreciation. $200,000, tax-free." John didn't even blink. He reached for the lid of the briefcase and closed it with a firm snap, pushing it back toward them. "I didn't help that boy for money," he said, voice steady. The aide hesitated, glancing at Hayes as if unsure what to do next. But Hayes had expected this. He studied John for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "That's what Walker said you'd say." John exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. Boy's got a decent read on people. Hayes motioned to his aide, who promptly pulled out another folder, placing it on the table where the briefcase had been. In that case, the general said, we anticipated an alternative that might be more to your liking. John raised a brow but didn't move. Hayes gestured toward the folder. This is a proposal for a Veterans Assistance Program in your name. John's brows knit together, suspicion creeping into his tone. In my name? Hayes nodded. The John Miller Veterans Assistance Program. It would be a fund dedicated to helping soldiers transition to civilian life, particularly those in rural areas like this one. Housing assistance, job training, medical care, all administered through the VA. John stared at the folder but didn't reach for it. Instead, he ran a hand over his jaw, considering. The idea had weight. He had seen it himself. Young men returning from war, lost in a country that no longer knew what to do with them. Soldiers trained to fight, to survive, only to be tossed back into a world that didn't understand the scars they carried. Some managed. Many didn't. Hayes seemed to read his thoughts. I know you've seen how hard it can be for these men to adjust. So have I. And if I'm being honest, we need more people like you on our side. John's fingers tapped lightly against the porch railing. He had spent years watching the world move on, watching the government make promises it never quite kept. He had learned not to put much stock in official programs, in the red tape that so often got in the way of real help. But this was different, because this wasn't about bureaucracy. This was about the men. And if there was even a chance that this program could give some kid coming home a better shot at life than his own son had gotten, then, well, maybe that was something worth standing behind. Finally, John reached out, flipping the folder open. He scanned the first few lines, his throat tightening at the words the John Miller Veterans Assistance Program, printed in bold at the top. He let out a slow breath. You're really going to do this? With your permission, Hayes confirmed. The money that was meant for you will seed the program, and it will be properly funded beyond that. You'd have no responsibility in running it, unless, of course, you wanted to. John chuckled. I'm a farmer, general, not a politician. Hayes smiled. That's exactly why people will trust it. John turned the folder over in his hands. He thought about the years he had spent alone, working land that had outlived generations of millers, carrying memories that had long since settled into dust. He thought about the ones who had never made it home, about their names etched in stone, about the weight their families carried. And he thought about Ethan Walker, a boy who had shown up on his porch in the middle of a storm, lost but still standing. A boy who had needed help and, by some twist of fate, had found it. John nodded slowly, tapping the folder against his palm before setting it back on the table. All right, he said. Let's do it. Hayes extended his hand. This time, John took it, and just like that, something bigger than both of them began. A week passed, and life on the farm carried on, as it always had. The cattle still needed feeding, the fences still needed mending, and the wheat, flattened in some places from the helicopters, had already begun to straighten, as if nature itself refused to dwell on what had happened. But John Miller hadn't quite moved on. Not in a bad way. Not in a way that left him restless, but in a way that made him pause every now and then, standing at the edge of his fields, staring out at the horizon, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle into his bones. He hadn't expected to hear from Ethan again. The visit had been enough. A handshake, an invitation to the ceremony, the knowledge that the boy was safe, that had been enough. But one afternoon, as he made his way back from town, he found a small package waiting for him in the mailbox. No return address, just his name, handwritten in strong, careful letters across the brown paper wrapping. John carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and poured himself a cup of coffee before unwrapping it. Inside, there were two things. The first was a small velvet box. The second was a folded letter. John reached for the letter first, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was the same as on the package, neat and deliberate. He took a sip of coffee and began to read. Dear Mr. Miller, by now, the dust has probably settled, literally and figuratively, from our unexpected visit. I wanted to write to you personally, away from the formality of uniforms and officers. What you did for me that night wasn't just offering shelter from a storm. You showed me that, in a world where people are increasingly suspicious and self-interested, goodness still exists. You didn't ask for an explanation, you didn't demand proof. You simply helped because it was the right thing to do. I don't know if you'll ever truly understand the impact of that. Because you helped one lost soldier, dozens of American lives were potentially saved. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't dramatic rescues or battlefield courage. Sometimes they're just opening a door when someone knocks, offering food when someone is hungry, believing in the best of people when the world tells you not to. I wanted to thank you properly, so I've enclosed something personal. The medal inside was awarded to me for the mission that brought me to your doorstep. I want you to have it, not as a military decoration, but as a reminder that your simple act of kindness had consequences far beyond what you could have imagined. I also included something else, a small token of appreciation for my unit. Not all heroes wear uniforms, sir, but if they did, I'd say yours would be made of flannel and worn leather boots. I'll see you at the ceremony next month. Until then, know that your kindness will never be forgotten. With deepest respect and gratitude, Ethan Walker. John let out a slow breath and set the letter down. Then, with careful fingers, he reached for the velvet box and opened it. Inside, nestled against dark fabric, was a military medal, crisp, polished, with an inscription on the back that caught the light as he tilted it. For the man who saved me when the world turned its back. John swallowed hard. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't needed it. But as he ran his thumb over the engraving, he felt the weight of it. Not just the medal and ribbon, but everything it represented. Finally, he turned to the second item, a small, round coin heavy in his palm. A challenge coin. One side bore the insignia of Ethan's unit. The other had something else. John's name. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Not all heroes wear uniforms, Ethan had written. John closed the box and sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the Texas sky. The sun was dipping low, the first hints of stars beginning to show, the vast openness stretching on forever. He had lived a long life, seen his share of war, loss, hardship. He had spent years believing that the biggest ripples came from the loudest waves. That real change was made by men in power, in command, in the places where decisions were written into history books. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe, just maybe, the real power wasn't in grand gestures or dramatic moments. Maybe it was in the quiet choices, the small kindnesses, the moments where a man had every reason to turn away, but didn't. John took the medal and slipped it into his pocket, where it settled comfortably, its weight grounding him. Then he stood, stretched, and stepped out onto his porch, watching as the night sky deepened, endless and full of quiet possibility. He had spent his life believing he was just a farmer. But maybe, just maybe, one good man at the right moment could change the world. As John stood on his porch that evening, the Texas sky stretched wide and endless before him, painted in deep purples and soft golds as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth from the recent storm. He let out a slow breath, hands resting on the wooden railing, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the grain. He thought about Ethan, about the knock on his door, the storm raging outside, and the moment he had looked into that young man's eyes and made a choice. It would have been easy to hesitate, to let caution override compassion, to turn away. The world told people to be careful, to mind their own business, to think twice before helping a stranger. And in a way, John understood that. Fear was a powerful thing. It whispered in a person's ear, telling them all the reasons not to get involved. But what if, just once, they ignored that voice? What if they chose to believe in the good of people instead of assuming the worst? John had made that choice. He had opened his door to a man he didn't know, fed him, gave him a place to rest, and in doing so, had unknowingly played a part in something far bigger than himself. His kindness had saved Ethan's life, and in turn, Ethan had saved others. That was the thing about kindness. It rippled outward. It never stopped at just one person. John had spent most of his years believing his time for making a difference had long passed. He had fought his wars, buried his loved ones, and lived his life as quietly as the land itself. He had thought the world had moved on without him. But now, as he stood there, the weight of a challenge coin in his pocket, a letter folded neatly inside his shirt, he realized something. A single act of kindness could change the course of a life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change the world. So the next time someone knocked on your door, or looked lost, or just needed a hand, what would you do? Would you hesitate? Or would you be the person who chose to help? Because history wasn't made by those who turn away. It was made by people like John Miller. And if you believe kindness always comes back, then maybe, just maybe, you were meant to hear this story today.